Urgent! This is for Kyiv. Hellish revenge from our side. After the most massive attack on Ukraine, the Russians received a harsh response right on the front line. Ukraine's defense forces instantly turned the occupiers' lives into real hell near Chasiv Yar.
More than 20 Russians were moving openly from the direction of Bakhmut. Reconnaissance spotted them. Artillery and drones took them apart, working together seamlessly.
Ukrainian defenders switched to maximum rage mode. For every strike on our cities, Russia pays with mountains of burned-out metal and thousands of lives. Swarms of FPV drones turned the elite armored vehicles of Putin's invaders into smoldering ruins. The Ukrainian armed forces achieved victory over the occupying troops on the Alexandrovsky front. Russian meat assaults with armored vehicles have essentially stalled here. This was stated by Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky. A nuclear disaster in Russia. Putin hid it, but reality was caught on camera. The Sarmat failed to reach its target. A horrifying truth emerged. The generals in the Kremlin were left reeling after such a failure. Putin's miracle weapon turned out to be a dud. More on all of this coming up. Watch until the end. Ukraine greets you today. Renata Aslanova and the latest events. The Kremlin is in hysteria. Putin's super missile has once again brought shame. Moscow is boasting about the successful launch of the heavy Sarmat monster, while the illegitimate dictator supposedly savored the launch online, showering the commander of the strategic missile forces, Sergei Karakayev, with compliments. But behind the polished facade of these official ceremonial reports lies a reality that is truly horrifying. They have been relentlessly tormenting the Sarmat missile for 13 long years, desperately trying to revive the aging spirit of the old voyevoda, yet the missile stubbornly and consistently refuses to take flight. The most recent test was nothing short of a complete and utter bloody circus. In November of 2025, this supposed wonder weapon crashed back to Earth just one single minute after its launch. Now Putin is once again feeding the entire world these grand tales about the most powerful system in existence, even though he had solemnly promised it would be fully operational on active combat duty back in 2023. The authorities have lied 6 times already, and now a new deadline has been set for the end of the year. But experts are sounding the alarm. Behind the bravado lies a catastrophic fiasco. Commentator Ivan Yakovina noticed a sensational detail. If earlier the generals were overflowing with excitement, reporting that the warheads had reached their target, now Karakayev looked frightened. His report was suspiciously brief. The launch was successful. The task was accomplished. And not a word about whether the missile hit anything at all. A deathly silence instead of triumph.
This is very strange. If the missile's flight had gone according to plan and the dummy warheads had hit their training targets, the head of the strategic missile forces would definitely have boasted about it. After all, his job isn't just to launch missiles but to deliver warheads to their targets. In this sense, a precise hit is much more important to him than a beautiful launch.
In addition, the expert notes that in one of the technical videos of the missile launch, its telemetry cuts off rather suspiciously. Maybe it was just a brief malfunction, or maybe it was something more serious. Yakovina is convinced that the shameful attempt was prepared for May 9th, with the skies closed from the Arctic to Kamchatka. But they only started talking about the success after 3 days of complete silence.
I'm almost certain that the missile was launched on May 9th and it even took off. But then, during the ascent phase, something went wrong, and it exploded again before reaching its target.
For 3 days, in anticipation of being exposed, the Kremlin frantically scanned the Western press and blogs, afraid to see footage of its own humiliation. And when it became clear that everything was clean, that there was nothing of the sort, Putin gave the go-ahead to show the launch video and listen to an empty report. Formally, they lied. The missile did indeed lift off from the ground, but where it ended, its journey remains a mystery.
Of course, Putin would have been thrilled to tear Karakayev's head off for yet another failed Sarmat test, but right now he desperately needs at least some kind of resounding strategic success. That's why he staged this farce with a successful launch, but without the missile actually hitting its target.
The head of the CCD, Andriy Kovalenko, has stated that the Kremlin's latest statements are a way to distract from failures on the front line.
Russia has no success at the front, so they need something to scare people.
Moreover, Putin is going all out, insisting that the Poseidon and Burevestnik will soon be on combat duty. The truth is, even Russians themselves no longer believe this nonsense.
It's a similar story with them. Putin announced both systems back in 2018 during his address to the Federal Assembly. But neither of them has ever actually reached combat duty.
It seems the Kremlin's superweapons are increasingly starting to look like a loud propaganda myth that keeps falling apart before our eyes. It only gets worse from here. The fairy tale about the invincible leader is over. Experts revealed a shocking truth. The dictator is in the weakest position he's ever been in during his reign. The front is cracking and Putin's political throne is starting to shake. What exactly is the aggressor's vulnerability, and why is his strategic collapse inevitable? Watch in the report.
The May 9th military parade, where the Kremlin traditionally tries to present the image of a strong and invincible country to the world, actually revealed Russia's decline, according to British intelligence. The lack of equipment, the reduced number of guests and participants, the blocking of mobile communications and the internet, all of this points to Moscow's depleted resources and its fear of Ukraine.
The scaled-down nature of the parade is likely due to the threat posed by Ukrainian drones and the shortage of military equipment resulting from the aggression against Ukraine. It is quite likely that the restrained character of the parade reflects the weakness of the aging leadership, which does not understand how to adequately respond to the threat from Ukrainian drones. From a report by British military intelligence on social network X,
Moscow no longer appears to be a city isolated from the war, notes the New York Times. The scale, range, and intensity of Kyiv's strikes on targets deep within Russian territory are increasing, writes The Economist. In March of 2026, Ukraine successfully surpassed Russia for the first time in the total number of long-range drone attacks. Ukrainian defense forces are striking Russian military and strategic targets located almost 2,000 kilometers from the border. This effectively means that 70% of Russia's entire population is already within the reach of Ukrainian drones.
Having endured a harsh winter when its cities and energy system were subjected to massive Russian drone and missile attacks almost every night, Ukraine is now turning the situation around. With almost every action it takes, Ukraine is inflicting increasingly significant damage on Russia. From a publication by The Economist.
An understanding is also gradually forming in Russia that Putin is incapable of winning the war against Ukraine, claims Russian opposition figure Garry Kasparov. And according to Russian political tradition, this is always perceived as a threat to the regime.
Obviously something is happening, which is why various signs are emerging, economic or military problems. But it seems to me that the main problem is psychological, and it is very important. It lies in the fact that the Russian tradition does not forgive a czar or dictator for losing a war. We don't understand what's happening with the masses, but with the elites it's obvious. Within the elite, an opinion is forming that in order to save the regime, Putin needs to be removed. Garry Kasparov, Russian opposition politician, in a comment to Ukrainian media.
The Kremlin's military and economic failures, business confiscations, and sanctions are not at all to the liking of Russian oligarchs. And this is one of the main reasons why officials, businessmen, and governors no longer see the regime's actions as a joint project, writes The Economist. Previously, Russia's war against Ukraine was their common goal. Now, more and more often, it is called Putin's personal affair. Moscow has lost Western markets, causing exports to fall and the economic crisis to deepen. And all Russians feel its consequences just as they do the results of the authorities' interference in citizens' private lives. For example, through internet restrictions and censorship. Previously, the Russian consensus was that the state did not interfere in people's lives and they did not interfere in politics. But now the state offers citizens repression and gives nothing in return.
And if Putin leaves, Russia will no longer be Russia. It will be some other state, it will be something different. And of course, Putin is extremely reluctant to display any signs of defeat. He remains determined to achieve a victorious outcome and wants to somehow extricate himself from this situation. And right now, he still has several more years remaining at his disposal to do this. He is not able to do it the way he wants. But they are still moving toward this goal. And we know that historically, basically, Russia has never paid attention to its losses. It has always gone all the way to the end. And the regime will either collapse, really, it will simply either fall apart, or they will destroy millions of their own citizens in Ukraine.
Continuing the war against Ukraine has become a matter of survival for Putin's regime. The Wall Street Journal has reported that only the very prospect of total defeat can force the Russian leadership to abandon its ambitions regarding Ukraine and Europe. Karina Laloyan reporting for Freedom TV channel.
Putin is enraged. After the disgraceful parade, he declared war on Armenia. Yerevan faces a Ukrainian hell as the Caucasus leaves Russia forever. Why do Putin's bluffs and empty threats no longer work, and how is Armenia disrupting the plans of the weakening pseudo-empire? Watch next.
If Armenia supports European integration in a referendum, it could follow the same path as Ukraine. This was stated by the Kremlin dictator, who also noted that if the country decides to pursue a European political course, it supposedly must take Moscow's opinion into account. Putin reminded that Ukraine also decided to join the European Union and that this was what led to the start of hostilities and the full-scale invasion by Russian troops. The head of the Kremlin warned that Armenia is now following the same path and that it would be better not to do so.
The Russian Foreign Ministry stated that extra-regional interference in the South Caucasus region is irresponsible and destructive, and is aimed at driving a wedge between the countries of the South Caucasus and Russia. The Russian Foreign Ministry warned that Western interference could lead to the most negative consequences for regional stability, security, and economic development, as well as to an uncontrollable increase in tensions in the region. From the report of the Institute for the Study of War.
On May 5th, the first-ever bilateral Armenia-EU summit was held in Yerevan, EU. Its main outcome was the declaration of a partnership based on mutual ties. Brussels and Yerevan intend to develop transport, energy, and digital networks within the framework of the European Global Initiative Global Gateway. An important step will be the support from the European Union to restore 3 key checkpoints on Armenia's borders with Turkey and Azerbaijan. Yerevan and Baku are trying to build peace after decades of hostility over Nagorno-Karabakh. The conflict ended in 2023 with the complete transfer of Karabakh under Baku's control. At the same time, Armenia has successfully reached a formal agreement to normalize relations with its neighbor Turkey. According to analysts, the primary obstacle to deep economic integration with Europe remains Armenia's trade dependence on Russia. Nevertheless, there is significant potential to overcome this barrier.
Russia is entangled in Ukraine. It currently lacks the necessary strength to influence its neighbors, nor does it possess the strength to sustain a comparable and consistent level of military and diplomatic presence there in the region. Therefore, perhaps the prevailing thought now is, it is either now or never for their future. That is exactly why we see both Azerbaijan and Armenia trying more and more to diversify their various diplomatic contacts. Azerbaijan is in a significantly more advantageous position because it has the full protection of Turkey, an enduring strategic alliance with Turkey. Armenia's situation is even more complicated. It is surrounded by Muslim countries, has no access to the sea, and Europe is quite far away.
But still, it is trying to do this to strengthen its ties to the West and to Europe, because it fully understands that the future with Russia is either deeply uncertain or even simply impossible for it.
Besides Armenia, the Russian Federation is making claims against Finland. The Kremlin dictator raised the question of why the country joined NATO. After all, according to him, Russia supposedly has no territorial disputes with Finland. The dictator also accuses the Finns of building a border along the Sestra River and claims that earlier they were allegedly expecting the collapse of the Russian Federation. This statement was made against the backdrop of the ongoing construction of a fence on the border with Russia, which is planned to be completed by the end of the year. At the same time, earlier the ambassador of the Russian Federation to Finland, Pavel Kuznetsov, stated that the country's accession to NATO has turned the Baltic region into a so-called zone of potential escalation. Kuznetsov threatened Finland and the alliance as a whole, claiming that Russia would supposedly have to respond to the buildup of NATO's material and human resources or the deployment of nuclear weapons in Finland. According to him, Russia's response will be appropriate, but not necessarily symmetrical.
Russian threats against NATO member states are aimed at forcing the West to exercise restraint. And Russian statements about imaginary threats allegedly coming from NATO are intended to create informational conditions to justify and support a supposed long-term geopolitical confrontation with the West. This is according to the latest report from the Institute for the Study of War.
The government in Moscow also tried to issue threats against Kyiv. The Russian Foreign Ministry called on European diplomats to begin evacuating their personnel from the Ukrainian capital as the Kremlin threatened to strike decision-making centers if Ukrainian drones were to unexpectedly attempt to disrupt the military parade. The head of the German Foreign Ministry, Jochen Wadefuhl, noted that such statements are nothing more than panic that has gripped Moscow since the consequences of Putin's endless series of serious miscalculations can no longer be concealed.
And this 9th of May holiday, and in fact the intense hysteria that the official Russian authorities and Russian propaganda stirred up on the eve of the holiday, only further exposed, revealed and laid bare outwardly the hopelessness, the dead-end nature, and in a sense, even the profound sense of exhaustion of this propaganda discourse. One would certainly like to hope that this exhaustion of the agenda is beginning to be deeply felt and recognized even within the Russian Federation itself.
Russia is trying to hold neighboring countries in check through threats and blackmail, but more and more states are choosing a different path, cooperation with Europe, and distancing themselves from Moscow. Pressure, statements about red lines, and attempts to influence the decisions of sovereign countries all confirm the Kremlin perceives any independent choice by its neighbors as a threat to its own influence. Karina Leloyan for Freedom TV channel.
The Russian Federation is selling its gold. Putin is trying to save the federal treasury. The system has cracked. Western pressure is mounting, sanctions are strangling the economy, and gold is being auctioned off. Zelensky is urging allies to increase the pressure in order to force the Kremlin to end the war.
Sweden has detained a sanctioned tanker in the Baltic Sea. Sweden's Minister for Civil Defense, Carl-Oskar Bolin, has officially stated that the vessel is suspected of being part of Russia's shadow fleet. It was sailing under the Syrian flag, and its destination is unknown. This information was officially reported by the Swedish Coast Guard. A preliminary investigation has been launched into the details of the detained ship's unseaworthiness, as it is currently listed on several sanctions lists, including those of the EU, Ukraine, and the United Kingdom. So far this year, Sweden has taken into custody 5 vessels on suspicion of a variety of maritime violations, including oil spills and sailing under a false flag. And the authorities have also opened a criminal case against some of the crew members.
The Swedish Coast Guard currently suspects that the vessel is sailing under a false flag, as there are a significant number of various uncertainties regarding its flag status and, as a direct consequence of this, it does not meet the seaworthiness requirements that have been established by international regulations and agreements. From a statement on the Swedish Coast Guard's website,
Ukraine is calling for tougher sanctions against Russia's shadow fleet. Experts note that to achieve an effective blockade, it is necessary to block another 200 to 400 vessels, as well as to synchronize strikes against the Kremlin's defense sector. Such a step should cut Moscow off from 400 billion in foreign currency revenue and deprive it of the technologies needed for weapons production.
this is precisely the specific area where we need to apply pressure first and foremost. When it comes to the actual size of Russia's shadow fleet, it is estimated that we are looking at approximately 20% of the world's entire tanker fleet. Russia constantly changes the flags, registration of the vessels, their crews, names, and so on. There is a continuous need to monitor and track the number of these tankers, which is an exceptionally difficult task. Igor Krupko, head of the analytical department at the ANT network.
The critical importance of strengthening European sanctions was strongly emphasized by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during his formal address at the European Political Community Summit in Yerevan. As stated by him, the goals of the Ukrainian side remain completely unchanged: to bring a worthy end to the war much closer, to further strengthen Ukraine's air defense and energy support, and to accelerate the full implementation of the €90 billion European loan.
This summer will be the very time, the very moment, when Putin will decide what to do next, to continue the war or to move towards diplomacy. And we will be pushing him towards diplomacy. It was announced that the May 9th parade in Moscow will take place without any military equipment on display. If this happens, it will be the first time in many, many years that they cannot afford to roll out military equipment for the parade. And the fact that our drones can buzz over Red Square shows our strength, and we must continue to put pressure on them with sanctions.
While Ukraine is strengthening its defenses against Russian aggression, the Kremlin is suffering from sanctions and trying to fill the holes in its budget. To this end, the Russian dictator Putin signed a law creating a sixth gambling zone to fill the budget system with gambling tax revenues, reports the Moscow Times. The new casinos will be located in the Altai Republic on the territory of a ski resort. The initiative first appeared at the end of last year from the Russian Ministry of Finance. They argued that the casinos would help develop the region and create jobs. Last year, the Federal Treasury had a deficit of more than 8 trillion rubles, and in the first quarter of 2026, the deficit exceeded 4,600 billion rubles.
In just 3 months, they already have a deficit greater than what they had planned for the entire 12 months of this 26th year. And here's another objective criterion. It's the current state of the regional budgets in Russia, which serve as the fundamental administrative components of the Russian Federation, where we see that there isn't even enough money for the most basic and essential public services and infrastructure, where there is always a concept of a crucial reserve fund in the budget system to quickly address the consequences of any unforeseen emergencies. So we clearly see that there isn't even enough money to properly deal with the aftermath in Dagestan, following those incredibly heavy rains that fell there recently and unfortunately caused such widespread and devastating natural disasters across the region.
In an attempt to save the federal treasury, Russia is selling off the gold it has been accumulating for 20 years, according to the Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service. The first sales of the gold reserves began in November 2025. For the first time, the central bank started selling gold directly to domestic buyers, banks, state-owned companies, and certain investment structures.
This is not an instant catastrophe, but the signal is important. A country that for years showcased the accumulation of reserves as a sign of strength is now spending them. The budgetary maneuver is narrowing, and the very fact of moving to sales highlights what Moscow would prefer to keep quiet about. The financial stability of the system has disappeared. From a statement on the website of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine.
The detention of shadow fleet tankers, tightening of sanctions, and financial pressure are gradually narrowing the Kremlin's ability to circumvent restrictions. And while Moscow tries to patch up the budget by selling gold and searching for new schemes, international pressure is only increasing, bringing closer the moment when economic resources to continue the war will become critically limited. Karina Laloyan for Freedom TV channel. What's your take on these latest events? Comment below, like the video, and stay updated with the main news.